whispers in the flames. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in the house on Elm Street. The kind of night where the only sound that pierced the silence was the occasional creak of old floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees and a low fog crept across the yard, adding to the eerie calm that hung in the air. Samantha and Michael had lived in the old house for nearly 5 years, a place they had bought for its charm and its history. The walls were lined with stories of families that had lived there long before them, but those stories had never felt real to them. Until that night. Until the night the house itself seemed to come alive with a darkness they couldn't explain. It started with the smell. Samantha had awoken in the dead of night to the faintest scent of something burning, but it wasn't strong enough to alarm her at first. She tried to dismiss it as the smell of something from the oven, perhaps left on too long earlier in the evening. But then the smell grew stronger, an acrid, bitter stench that made her stomach churn. She glanced over at Michael, asleep beside her, his steady breathing the only sound in the room. The clock on the nightstand read 3:27 a.m. Samantha pulled the covers off and swung her legs over the side of the bed, feeling the coolness of the hardwood floor against her bare feet. She crept across the room and tiptoed down the hallway toward the kitchen. The house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. There were no sounds of creaking wood or the usual noises of the house settling into the night. The silence felt suffocating, like the air itself was thickening around her. When she reached the kitchen, she froze. The stove was off, and there was nothing that should have been burning. But the smell, stronger now, seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Her eyes darted to the windows where the fog had thickened, making the glass appear as though it was covered in frost. But it wasn't cold. No, there was something wrong with the air in the house. Something unnatural. Before she could investigate further, a loud pop echoed from behind her. She spun around, her heart racing in her chest, but saw nothing. No one. Just the stillness of the kitchen. And then the lights went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, as if the very light of the house had been swallowed up by the shadows. Samantha's breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone in her pocket, her hands shaking. The flashlight illuminated the room, but there was no comfort in the pale beam that cut through the blackness. The shadows seemed to stretch like they were alive, reaching for her. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she nearly dropped it from the shock. A message from Michael. "Samantha, where are you? Something's wrong with the gas. I smell it. I think we need to get out." Her stomach dropped. Gas. She had smelled it faintly earlier, but it hadn't connected. She turned on her heels and rushed back down the hallway, her mind racing. But as she reached the door to the bedroom, it slammed open with a deafening crash. Michael stood in the doorway, his face pale and panic-stricken. "Sam, the house is on fire," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "The gas. It's leaking, and I don't know how long we have. We need to get out now." Samantha felt her breath catch in her throat as the realization hit her like a wave. The fire, the gas, the suffocating silence. Everything was a threat. And they were trapped. The smoke began to creep under the door, thick and acrid, burning her lungs with every shallow breath she took. She grabbed Michael's hand, and together they rushed to the stairs, but the house seemed to be alive, groaning, creaking as though it were fighting them, pushing them back. They reached the front door, only to find it stuck. Locked. They struggled, their panic mounting as the seconds felt like hours. Finally, Michael kicked the door with all his strength, and it gave way with a splintering crack. Outside, the cool night air hit them like a shock to the system. They didn't look back. They couldn't. Behind them, the house that had once felt like a home was now a roaring inferno, flames licking the sky, casting an orange glow over the street. They stood there, frozen, watching in horror as the house burned, the sounds of crackling wood and breaking glass filling the air. It wasn't just the fire that terrified them. It was the feeling that something had been waiting, watching, that the house had been waiting for them to make that one fatal mistake. As the fire trucks arrived with their blaring sirens and flashing lights, Samantha collapsed onto the grass, her knees giving way beneath her. Michael stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, but even his touch couldn't bring comfort. The house was gone. The home they had built their life in was nothing but ash, But as the fire burned and the smoke cleared, one thought lingered in Samantha's mind. Why hadn't they woken up sooner? This opening sets up a dramatic, intense atmosphere, with the looming threat of both the house fire and the gas leak. From here, you can continue exploring the psychological horror aspects, the mystery of the fire, the trauma they experience, and whether the house's strange behavior has a deeper, more sinister explanation. The fire raged behind them, devouring the house they had once called home. The smoke hung thick in the air, choking and suffocating, but Samantha couldn't tear her eyes away from the blaze. Her heart hammered in her chest, a relentless beat that echoed in her ears as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind was a jumble of thoughts, racing and colliding like cars in a pileup. Why hadn't they woken up? Why had it taken so long for the gas to make itself known? She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, not from the night air, but from the creeping fear that had settled in her chest. Michael stood beside her, his face pale under the harsh glare of the fire's orange glow. His hands trembled at his sides. He had been the one to smell the gas, the one who had been awake when the house started to betray them. He had saved them. But why had it taken so long for either of them to notice? Was the house trying to kill them? "Michael," she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible over the roar of the flames. How did it happen?" Michael didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at the fire, his eyes glazed with shock. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. "I don't know, Sam. I don't know." He paused, swallowing hard. "I woke up because of the smell. It was faint at first, like something burning. But then, it got stronger. The gas, I smelled it in the kitchen and I knew we had to get out. I thought maybe it was just a malfunction, a leak or something. But when I tried to turn on the stove, the gas, it just started pouring out. I didn't know what to do." Samantha felt her knees give out, and she collapsed onto the grass, her hands pressed against her face as the reality of the situation hit her like a slap. They could have died. They almost had. "We almost didn't make it, Michael," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and disbelief. What if we were asleep just a little longer? What if the fire had started, when we were still inside? Michael sat down beside her, his face clouded with guilt. "I don't know. I don't know why it didn't happen sooner. I don't know what happened." There was a long silence between them, the only sounds now the crackling of the fire and the distant wail of sirens. The fire trucks had arrived, but the flames were still consuming the house at an alarming rate. The heat from the fire was intense, even from a distance, and Samantha could feel her skin tightening from the heat. The firefighters moved quickly, organizing their teams to douse the flames, but Samantha didn't care about the fire anymore. It felt like a distant problem now, something that was happening to someone else. Her mind was elsewhere, on the house, on the gas leak, on the strange things she had noticed in the moments leading up to the fire. "Do you think—" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Do you think the house did this? That it was trying to hurt us?" Michael's eyes darted to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Samantha's gaze flicked back toward the house. It seemed to flicker in the orange glow of the fire, the shapes of the windows and door frames twisted and warped as if the structure itself was alive. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. But something was wrong. She felt it in her bones. "I don't know. It's just, when I woke up, everything felt off. The smell, the silence, it wasn't normal. And then the gas leak. It just doesn't make sense." Michael looked down at his hands, still shaking. He didn't have an answer. He didn't want to think about it either. But a part of him, deep inside, couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had happened in that house. The fire, the gas leak, the strange sense of dread. It all seemed to fit too perfectly together. As the firefighters continued to work, one of them approached them, a grim expression on his face. "We're sorry, folks," he said. "There's nothing we can do. The house is gone." Samantha nodded numbly, her mind too foggy to process the words. Her home was gone, reduced to ash and rubble. But her heart was heavy with something else, a gnawing, primal fear that wouldn't let go. The fire was starting to subside, but the damage had already been done. The once beautiful home they had spent years building and furnishing was now nothing but a charred skeleton of its former self. Samantha could barely make out the shape of the roof, now caved in. The walls collapsed in on themselves like a giant's crumpled paper. The kitchen window was shattered, the frame blackened and twisted. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow moving within the wreckage, just on the edge of the flames. But then it became clearer. There, in the ruins of the house, something moved. Something alive. Samantha's breath hitched as she stood up, her legs unsteady. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" Michael followed her gaze, his eyes widening in disbelief. "What is that?" A figure emerged from the wreckage, tall, thin, and cloaked in shadows. It seemed to be walking toward them, its movements slow but deliberate. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. There was something wrong about it. Something unnatural. As the figure came closer, the air grew colder. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse racing. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her feet were rooted to the spot, her body paralyzed by a fear she couldn't comprehend. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. The flames flickered one last time and then died out completely, leaving the night bathed in an eerie, unnatural quiet. The figure stood motionless in the ruins of the house, staring directly at Samantha and Michael with empty eyes. Its face was obscured in shadow, but the hollow, unblinking stare sent chills through Samantha's very soul. A voice, soft and raspy, like a whisper in the dark, reached her ears. "You should never have stayed." The words echoed in Samantha's mind as the shadowed figure stood motionless in the wreckage. "You should never have stayed." The voice was low, almost a hiss, but it seemed to reverberate in the air, like it had been carried by the very house itself. Samantha's pulse quickened, her entire body frozen in place, unable to look away from the dark figure that stood among the smoldering ruins of their home. Michael, still beside her, gripped her arm tightly, his fingers cold and clammy. "Sam, we need to go. Now." But Samantha couldn't move. She couldn't look away from the figure. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body felt like it was trapped in a nightmare. She wasn't sure if what she was seeing was real anymore. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence oppressive, filling the air with a cold, suffocating weight. It didn't walk like a person. It glided, almost as if it was being pulled by some unseen force. The closer it got, the colder the air became. It felt like the night itself was closing in, a wall of darkness surrounding them. Samantha's breath hitched as the figure's face became clearer. It was obscured at first, but now she could see it. A hollow face, empty eyes that seemed to suck in the light, leaving nothing behind but a void. No features, no expression, just darkness. "Michael, it's not human," she whispered, her voice trembling. She finally managed to tear her eyes away from the figure to glance at him, but his face was pale, his jaw clenched as though he were trying to hold back the wave of fear that was threatening to overtake him. "I see it too," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The figure stopped just a few feet away from them, its presence almost suffocating. It didn't speak again. It didn't need to. There was something in its silence that felt more menacing than any words could ever convey. Samantha felt her legs give way as the fear overwhelmed her. She collapsed to her knees, her breath shallow, the world around her spinning. Michael caught her, his hands shaking as he tried to hold her steady. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, but his voice sounded distant, as though it was coming from far away. It was as though the space between them and the figure had stretched, creating a divide that was growing impossible to cross. But the figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching them with those empty eyes. Samantha's mind raced, her thoughts spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was this thing? Why had it come from the ruins of their home? And most importantly, why had it spoken to them? Suddenly, there was a deafening crack. The sound was like the breaking of bones, a sharp, sickening noise that made Samantha flinch. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and for a moment she thought she felt the very foundation of the earth shift. Then, the figure was gone. It vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The night air was still again, but the chill remained. Samantha's chest heaved with shallow breaths as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. It had felt real. Too real. But now it was gone. Vanished into the smoke and the ash. "Michael, did you see that? Was that real?" She gasped, her voice cracking. Michael didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the spot where the figure had stood, his face pale and tense. Slowly, he nodded. "I saw it, but I don't understand what it means." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire had long since burned itself out, leaving behind a ghostly stillness. The firefighters had gone, leaving only the wreckage of the house and the ashes that scattered in the wind. But Samantha and Michael both knew this wasn't over. The house was gone, but whatever dark force had been hiding inside it was not. In the days that followed, the two of them tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. They stayed with Michael's sister, who lived just outside the city, but the feeling of displacement was unbearable. The world outside was unchanged, but inside they were both haunted by what they had seen. Every time Samantha closed her eyes, she saw that figure, its hollow face, its unblinking stare. Every time she went to sleep, she could hear the whispering voice, like a soft echo in the back of her mind, telling her that they had made a mistake. "You should never have stayed." It was as though the house had never really let them leave. The fire had been only the beginning. It had been a warning. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. Small things at first. Objects in the new house would move, just slightly, as though someone had brushed past them. Samantha would find things out of place when she was certain she had left them exactly where they belonged. But then, the occurrences grew more intense. One night, after Michael had gone to bed, Samantha was alone in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She heard it then, the soft whisper of something in the corner of the room. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks, but then she heard it again, louder this time. A cold chill ran down her spine as she looked up, her eyes scanning the darkened room. There, just out of her peripheral vision, she saw something move, something human-sized but unnatural, its shape flickering and shifting like smoke. Her breath caught in her throat. "Michael?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly stood, the fear crawling up her spine like icy fingers. She didn't know what to do or what was happening, but one thing was clear. Whatever had been in the house on Elm Street had followed them, and it wasn't done yet. The presence they felt wasn't just a shadow of the past. It was something darker, an evil that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fire had been the first sign, the figure, a warning. And as the whispers returned, the suffocating dread in the pit of her stomach grew stronger. The house wasn't just haunted by memories. It was haunted by something alive, something that wanted them to pay. The questions began to pile up. What had happened to the previous owners of the house? What had been the true cause of the fire? And what was it that the house had been hiding, waiting for them to uncover? But every answer led to more questions, each one darker and more twisted than the last. And Samantha knew, with a certainty she couldn't shake, that the house on Elm Street hadn't burned down by accident. It had been the house itself that had burned, consumed by its own darkness, by a force that had been building for years. And now, it was looking for a new home,